This India Ink value scale tutorial will show you the basics of working with ink. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button and support this public school teacher's side hustle. Find me on TikTok and Instagram to see what my students are up to in my classroom. I am painting on watercolor paper. I have a set of brushes, India ink, any brand will work. I'm going to start by adding water in a paint well next to my black ink. With my small round brush, I'm going to add just the tiniest amount of ink. A little bit goes a long way. Ink is very watery. It will stain your clothes forever, so be very careful. And then the first section I'm going to paint, I want to be my lightest gray. So the section I left blank is white. So the idea is that this is the lightest gray after white. Then I'm going to create a second value, and hopefully that's somewhere light to medium gray. So a value scale is an artist's technique of practicing, much like a musician practices scales or an athlete does drills. This is helping you understand the material and helping you have a good sense of control. India ink is unlike any other paint. It's not acrylic, it's not watercolor, even though there's similarities. And its simplicity creates beautiful artwork, but it can be difficult to control without practice. As I'm progressing here, you can see I'm just adding ink to that same section in my palette, and just a little bit goes a long way. And I'm progressing from my lightest gray to light medium, and I'm getting close to medium gray. I'm not going to do a number. Some teachers, and I have done this before, has said, okay, we're going to paint 7 values, but sometimes that limits how many grays you can actually make. And so I'm just going to say I'm going to make as many values as it takes to get from white to black, consistently progressing from light to dark. So that's too dark, as you can see. So I took my brush and wiped some of it off in my palette. And as I drag it over the paper, it does dilute it a little bit. Making sure your brush does not have too much ink on it or too much water is going to help you with this. I'm using a small round brush. That is just the brush of choice when I'm working at this scale. Some of my students like to use a square brush, but I find that it has more bristles, and then I have less control over mixing my values. So I prefer to mix with the round brush and to paint the value scale with the round brush too. But part of being an artist is figuring out what works for you. You can see that we're now at the medium gray, and these 3 are starting to look kind of similar. So let's see if we can make this one darker by overlapping. That looks better. Trying to make sure that I'm still kind of not making my sections too small. I tell my students, if you can't fit your thumbprint in your value scale, it's too teeny tiny, too hard to control. Work even larger than I'm working if you can. Now we're officially in medium to dark gray. So these are transitional values. Not black yet. Jet black with India ink is very opaque, very rich. It's such a gorgeous color. So we're not there yet, but we're getting close. And I would definitely consider this a dark gray. Not my darkest gray, but getting there. Adding just a little bit more ink here. That looks about the same. So let's add just a little bit more. Wiping my brush so it doesn't have too much water or ink on it. Still kind of looks the same. So you can always let it dry and go over it again, or just keep going over it. Keep in mind though, the more you rub your brush over your paper, sometimes your paper might protest. This looks nice and dark. Again, not black yet. You'll see when it's jet black, you'll know. Let's add a little bit more. And again, that's why I didn't set a number of how many values I was going to paint. That's a really good dark gray. I just want to get from white to black. More is better. Let's see if I can make one more dark gray. Almost running out of my paper here. And I think the next value is probably black. Let me take a square brush to show you a different technique here. And boom, jet black on the edge of my paper. I even like to let it dry and then do a second coat. Okay, so that was white to black. I'm gonna clean out my palette here. How do you do black to white? So first one's always the easiest because it's just solid black or the white of your paper. And you can see now I'm going to be adding ink next door instead of water. So now instead of adding a little bit of ink, I will be adding a little bit of water to this section I've created. Always keep pure ink nearby and then dilute it in 1, 2, or even 3 wells. I've had students create a little section for each value of ink as they're painting, and you can see that did not change. So let's put a little bit more here. But for a value scale, I just kind of keep 1 and kind of build up as I go. If you're doing something where you're using a range of values, it is good advice to mix them in advance so you have them, and a paper towel can be your friend if the ink is being tricky. I like to start my students with light gray because you can see how dominant the ink is. When you start with dark, sometimes it's hard to get those nuanced, beautiful light grays. And so sometimes it's fun to focus on those first, since India ink naturally wants to be dark. And so focusing on the lighter values can give you a sense of control that you might not have if you start with the black. But again, part of being an artist is figuring out what works for you. Another trick is to separate your ink to even a smaller section, because just like with paint, a smaller section will be changed easier than a large section of paint or ink. And so a little bit of water will make a difference here, where it might take more water in a larger section. Oh, this is fun because you can see the value scale above. It's starting to match up in our medium gray section. Trying to make that just a little lighter because it looks similar to the one above it. And I'm not going to give myself a number again. I'm just going to say I'm going to start black, and I'll mix as many values until I get to white, focusing on smooth transition of values. See, that one looked the same until I spread it out a little bit. Adding more water here. Playing around with the texture. You can always blot with the paper towel if you need to. We're in our light grays for sure, so I'm going to make this small section here so I can have a lot of control. I call this dirty paint water gray because it's so light that it's almost, if you use ink a lot, just the color or value of your dirty paint water that you're cleaning your brush with. That's truly dirty paint water gray right there. And then let's see if I can do one. What am I doing here? Oh, I'm going back and touching up. Sometimes I forget what I'm doing. Going back and making sure that that is dark gray and not black. Same thing here. Just touching it up. And then this is the fun part for me is, like I said, go back and paint one more time, a second, sometimes third coat. If you want a nice, really stark black, layering will help you get that effect. And white is really fun because it's just the white of your paper, but resist the urge to draw like a box around it. Just let the white speak for itself. So I think I'm pretty much done here. Thank you so much for sticking around and learning ink with me. And if you're interested in more ink tutorials, check these out. Find my website, thatartteacher.com. I have a full-length India ink landscape lesson plan, totally free with student examples. And if you are interested in teaching resources or paint night at home resources, that's all for free on my website.